The sun hung low over the rugged hills, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. As the creaking wheels of the wagon kicked up clouds of dry, dusty creek dirt, Maggie Thompson tightened her shawl around her shoulders, the coarse fabric scratching her neck, and squinted at the small town ahead. Dusty Creek wasn't much, just a scattering of wooden buildings, a saloon with swinging doors, a blacksmith shop, and a livery stable, but it was home now. Or as close as any place could be for someone like her. People in towns like this didn't have much patience for women who didn't fit the mold. Maggie was no stranger to whispers and pointed fingers. At 28 she carried more weight than most. Her round cheeks and heavy frame drawing unwanted attention wherever she went. Too fat to dance, too ugly to marry, she muttered to herself, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. She had heard that phrase enough times in her life to memorize it. The wagon hit a pothole, jostling her papers and parcels, and Maggie cursed under her breath. Her goal was simple: find work, lay low, and avoid the kind of trouble that seemed to follow women like her. She had no illusions about being welcomed with open arms. Dusty Creek was a frontier town, ruled by cowboys, miners, and gamblers, all of them judging a person by appearance before anything else. As she rolled the wagon down the dusty main street, she noticed the usual crowd of townsfolk, men wiping sweat from their foreheads, a couple of children chasing a stray dog, and a few women staring through saloon windows. Heads turned, as she knew they would, and she stiffened, trying to make herself small. A few chuckles and whispers followed her, but Maggie had learned long ago to let that slide. She wasn't here for friendship. She was here for survival. And then she saw him. Leaning against the post, outside the saloon, was a man unlike any she'd ever encountered in Dusty Creek. Broad-shouldered, suntanned, with a weathered face that could have belonged to a mountain or a canyon. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, tilted just enough to shade his eyes. A rifle rested against the post, and his boots were caked with dust. But there was something in his stance, unshakable, almost deliberate, that made Maggie pause. He was tall, rugged, and mysterious. The kind of man who seemed carved out of the very land itself. He watched her, but not like the others. There was no sneer, no laughter behind his hand. Just a steady gaze that made Maggie uneasy. And then, unexpectedly, he tipped his hat ever so slightly. New in town. His voice was low, measured, carrying the kind of weight that made people listen even if they didn't want to. Maggie hesitated, brushing a stray curl from her face. Depends on who's asking, she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. He chuckled softly, not mockingly. Name's Jed Hawkins. Folks call me a man of few words. You? Maggie Thompson. She climbed down from the wagon, keeping her eyes level with his. Just passing through, trying to find work. Mostly. Jed's eyes softened ever so slightly, and he nodded. Work? Huh, not much of that around here. That doesn't involve breaking your back or your spirit. Maggie smirked. I've got a strong back. And a stubborn spirit. That made him grin, a flash of white teeth against the tanned backdrop of his face. Well, I like stubborn. Gets things done round here. Don't get many folks with grit like that. For a moment, the world seemed quieter. Maggie felt a strange flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sliver of hope. Maybe Dusty Creek wouldn't be all whispers and ridicule. Maybe someone could see her for what she was, instead of what she wasn't. Then a gust of wind carried the unmistakable sound of the saloon doors swinging, followed by laughter and a raucous piano tune. Jed glanced toward the building, then back at Maggie. Come on, he said, nodding toward the town. If you're sticking around, you best learn the lay of the land. Dusty Creek don't forgive the unprepared. Maggie lifted her chin, adjusting her shawl. Lead the way, Mr. Hawkins. As they walked toward the heart of the town, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She had expected scorn, maybe even cruelty, but instead she'd found a man who saw her hand, not just the outside. Maybe, just maybe, Dusty Creek held more than dirt, dust, and judgment. Maybe it held a beginning, and beginnings, Maggie knew, were dangerous and exhilarating. The evening sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over Dusty Creek. The saloon's swinging doors creaked as Maggie approached, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Music and laughter spilled into the street, the raucous piano keys and the clatter of glasses announcing a night of revelry. She paused for a moment, adjusting her shawl, staring at the rowdy crowd through the dusty windows. Inside, the saloon was alive with the smells of whiskey, sweat, and smoke curling in the lantern light. Men crowded the bar, tipping their hats and slapping each other on the back. Women in flowing skirts twirled across the floor, their laughter ringing clear above the piano. Maggie's breath hitched. She had hoped to stay unnoticed, but everyone noticed her. That was the curse of being different in a town that worshipped sameness. She stepped inside anyway, her boots clicking on the wooden floor. Heads turned instantly. A few men smirked, whispering to each other. One woman's eyes narrowed, her lip curling in disdain. Who let her in? Maggie could almost hear it echoing through the air. She forced herself to walk with purpose, ignoring the stares and whispers, but the knot of tension in her stomach didn't loosen. Jed Hawkins was already there, leaning against the bar with his elbows resting on the polished wood. His hat was tilted back, and a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth when he saw her. "Figured you'd come," he said quietly. Maggie gave him a small nod, grateful for the silent support. She moved toward an empty chair, hoping to sink into the shadows, but the floor was too cramped, too exposed. Then the piano player struck a lively chord, and a call for a dance echoed through the room. Couples began forming, spinning across the floor in boots and skirts. Maggie froze. She knew what was coming. She could feel the eyes on her, measuring, judging. Too fat to dance, too ugly to even try. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and turned toward Jed. "You don't have to," he said softly, noticing her hesitation. "I know," she replied, her voice tight, "but I want to." A chorus of chuckles erupted from a group of men near the bar. One of them, a lanky young man named Clay, called out, "Hey, watch yourself. That floor's for pretty girls." Maggie's cheeks flushed, but instead of retreating, she squared her shoulders and walked onto the floor. She wasn't a graceful dancer, and the rhythm was foreign to her, but she moved with determination. She spun, stomped, and swung her arms, letting the music carry her. Some of the onlookers laughed, but she didn't care. She was dancing for herself, for the first time in years. Jed watched from the sidelines, his grin growing. He had seen many women falter under the town's cruelty. But Maggie's defiance sparked something rare, a mix of admiration and intrigue. He stepped onto the floor, not to dance, but to stand nearby. A silent shield as the song reached its peak. Clay swaggered toward her, attempting to pull her into an awkward spin. "Step lightly, big girl," he sneered. Maggie's temper flared. With a quick pivot, she evaded him, her movement sharp and deliberate. The room fell silent for a heartbeat. Every eye turned to her, and for the first time, the laughter felt uneasy. Jed's voice broke through the tension. "Leave her be, Clay." His tone carried authority, like a gunshot in a quiet canyon. Clay froze, then stepped back, muttering under his breath. Maggie's chest heaved with relief, and she gave Jed a grateful glance. For the rest of the evening, she danced, not caring who watched or what they thought. By the time the music slowed and the lanterns dimmed, she was flushed, sweaty, and alive in a way Dusty Creek hadn't allowed her to feel in years. A few townsfolk had begun to look at her differently, perhaps realizing there was more to Maggie Thompson than the rumors whispered, as she walked out of the saloon into the cool night. Jed fell into step beside her. "Not bad," he said quietly, nodding toward her. Maggie laughed, a sound that felt foreign yet freeing. "Not bad. I nearly fell on my face half a dozen times." Jed grinned, tipping his hat. "That's half the charm. You've got guts, Maggie. Not many folks round here can hold their own in a room full of judgmental eyes." She felt warmth in his words, a spark of recognition that went beyond looks or whispers. For the first time since arriving in Dusty Creek, Maggie felt like maybe, just maybe, she belonged. And as the moon rose over the dusty streets, she realized that the night hand, perhaps the town, was just beginning to change. The morning sun rose pale and unforgiving over Dusty Creek, scattering gold across the dust-choked streets. Maggie Thompson stood at the edge of town, boots planted firmly in the dirt, a bundle of supplies slung over her shoulder. Today wasn't about dances or gossip, it was about work. The livery stable needed extra hands to deliver feed and supplies to the ranches out on the trail, and Maggie had volunteered. Jed Hawkins appeared beside her without a sound, the dust swirling around his boots as if he had stepped out of the shadows themselves. He tipped his hat. "Trail work ain't easy," he said, voice low, carrying the weight of someone who'd ridden these paths for decades. "You sure you want in on this?" "I'm sure," Maggie replied, tightening her shawl. "I can handle a horse and a load of oats. Don't let my size fool you." Jed gave a small grin. "We'll see about that." The first stretch of the trail was deceptively calm. The wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and the temps of distant cattle. Maggie guided her horse carefully, trying to match Jed's effortless pace. The cowboy was silent, observing her with quiet attention. He didn't speak much, but the way he handled the reins and the terrain said everything she needed to know. Hours passed without incident until a sudden clatter echoed from the ridge above. Maggie froze, squinting at the ridge where shadows moved faster than they should. Bandits, she whispered, heart hammering. Jed's hand went to the rifle slung across his back. Could be, he muttered, or worse. Before she could respond, a group of rough-looking men appeared, their faces masked with dust and scarves, rifles raised. Hold it right there, the leader barked. Empty your packs. Maggie's stomach twisted. She had never faced real danger like this. But retreat wasn't an option. She gripped the reins tighter, her pulse racing. She could see Yet's jaw tighten as he assessed the situation. Step aside, Jed said calmly, his voice carrying a deadly authority. No one needs to get hurt today. The leader laughed, a cruel, grating sound. And who's gonna stop us, cowboy? You. Jet's eyes narrowed. I said, step aside. Time seemed to stretch as Maggie watched him, heart pounding. She didn't want to be helpless. Without thinking, she swung her bag of supplies half oats, half tools toward a loose rock. It tumbled down the trail, creating a dust cloud that startled the bandits and sent their horses skidding. Jed took the opening. Moving like a shadow, rifle ready, the bandits hesitated, unsure of the cowboy who moved with lethal precision. Maggie's unexpected action had bought him just enough time. He fired a warning shot into the ground near their feet, sending dirt and sparks flying. Chaos erupted. Horses reared, shouts filled the air, and Maggie found herself gripping her reins tighter than ever. Somehow, she managed to keep her horse steady, weaving through the dust and gunfire. She realized she was actually enjoying the adrenaline, the rush of proving she wasn't helpless. In a final moment, Jed lunged forward, knocking one bandit off his horse while the others scattered into the hills, spitting curses over their shoulders. Silence fell over the trail, broken only by the heavy breathing of Maggie and the soft snort of her horse. Jed approached, his expression unreadable, but there was a glint of approval in his eyes. Well, he said, brushing dust from his jacket, you've got guts, Maggie. Not many women and not many men would have pulled that off. Maggie exhaled slowly, her legs trembling, her heart still hammering. I didn't think I could, she admitted, voice shaking. I just didn't want to be useless. You weren't, Jed said firmly. You were brave, smart too. For a moment, Maggie looked at him, really looked, and saw not judgment, but respect. Something in his steady gaze made her feel strong, capable, more alive than she had in years. Dusty Creek might have seen her as too fat to dance, too ugly to wed, but on that trail, in the face of real danger, none of that mattered. As they rode back toward town, Maggie felt a shift inside herself. The trail had tested her in ways the saloon never could, and she had proven that her spirit was far larger than the world's expectations. Jed rode beside her, a quiet, steady presence, and she realized that maybe, just maybe, there were people in this world who could see her for who she truly was. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills again, casting long shadows over the town, Maggie knew one thing for certain: Dusty Creek was dangerous, unforgiving, and wild, but it was exactly the place she needed to be. And for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Dusty Creek woke the next morning to a sky streaked with pale orange and pink, the kind of light that made every building and every horse look gilded with gold. Maggie Thompson walked past the saloon, humming a little tune from the night before, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The memory of the dance, and the adrenaline from the trail, still made her chest swell with pride. She thought she had begun to understand her place in this rough town. But Dusty Creek had a way of reminding newcomers that it had its own rules and its own mysteries. Jed Hawkins was already outside the livery stable when she arrived, standing next to a large, burlap sack tied at the top. The sack looked ordinary at first glance, but the way Jed handled it carefully, almost reverently, made Maggie pause. What's in the sack? She asked, tilting her head. Jed shrugged, the hint of a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. That, Miss Thompson, is none of your concern. For now, not your concern, Maggie echoed, folding her arms. Since when do I take kindly to secrets? Jed's eyes twinkled. Since now, he said, lifting the sack effortlessly onto his shoulder. But I promise, it ain't dangerous. Not in the way you're thinking. The townsfolk began to gather, as they always did when something unusual appeared. Dusty Creek had a way of sniffing out the unknown. And a large sack carried by Jed Hawkins was the definition of unknown. Looks heavy, one of the saloon men muttered, stepping closer, curiosity brimming. You planning on selling it, trading it, or hiding gold from the government? Jed chuckled softly. Nothing like that, just carrying something important. And believe me, it matters more than what's inside than the weight it carries. Maggie frowned, stepping closer. Important to whom? Jed looked at her steadily. Important to me, and maybe important to you, too. In time. She didn't like the ambiguity, but she could sense no deceit in his voice. There was something in Yet's manner that made people trust him even when his actions were mysterious. Come on. Then, he said, slinging the sack onto his horse. We've got to deliver this before the sun gets high. It's going to be a long day on the trail. Maggie mounted her horse, curiosity burning. The trail was familiar by now, the dust rising in lazy plumes beneath the hooves of their horses, but the sack remained a puzzle. Every time she glanced at it, she imagined it containing anything from a treasure of gold coins to something completely ordinary, like feed or blankets. They rode in silence for hours, the only sounds the clatter of hooves and the occasional whisper of wind through the dry brush. The isolation of the trail gave Maggie time to think, to imagine, and to feel that strange flutter in her chest whenever Jed was near. At one point, Jed glanced at her. You're quieter than usual. I'm thinking, Maggie replied cautiously, about the sack, about this town, about everything. Jed nodded slowly. Thinking can be dangerous out here. Keeps you from noticing what's right in front of you. Maggie's brows furrowed. And what's right in front of me? Jed didn't answer immediately, just smiled faintly. She could feel it in his silence, a challenge, a promise, a secret waiting to be revealed. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing near a small creek. Jed tied his horse and gently set the sack on the ground. Maggie dismounted, trying to hide her eagerness. Wait here, Jed said, kneeling next to the sack. He untied the rough burlap slowly, carefully, as if the act itself demanded reverence. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, catching the edges of the sack as he worked. Maggie's heart raced. She had no idea what to expect. Gold, a valuable item. Or something far stranger. Jed finally looked up at her, eyes serious, voice steady. You've got courage, Maggie. You've proven it, on the trail and on the dance floor. And that's why. This is for you. Maggie blinked, her stomach fluttering. Her hands itched to see what was inside, but Jed's gaze held her in place. For me. Jed nodded. Patience, Miss Thompson. Some things are worth waiting for. Maggie felt a strange thrill, a mix of anticipation and confusion. Dusty Creek had already tested her strength, her courage, and her pride. Now it was testing her patience. And somehow, she felt that whatever lay inside that sack would change everything. The sun dipped low, shadows lengthening across the trail. Maggie looked at Jed, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The sack was more than a mystery. It was a turning point, and she was ready to face whatever came next, whatever secrets it held, whatever challenges it brought, and whatever truths about herself she was about to discover. The next morning, Dusty Creek was painted in shades of golden brown, the hills rising like silent sentinels over the small town. Maggie tightened the straps of her saddle, her mind still swirling with curiosity about the mysterious sack Jed had brought yesterday. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and horse sweat, and she felt a familiar thrill today. The trail awaited. Jed stood beside his horse, adjusting the strap of the burlap sack with practiced hands. Trail's rough today, he said, voice low and serious. Some parts washed out in last week's rain. Could be dangerous if you're not careful. I've handled the trail before, Maggie replied, trying to sound confident, though her fingers itched nervously at the reins. I can handle whatever comes our way. Jed's eyes met hers. I know you can, but sometimes, even the strongest can be caught off guard. That's why I ride with you. We look out for each other. They rode out of town together, the sound of hooves pounding the dirt trail echoing across the hills. Maggie felt the wind on her face, the sun warming her back, and the freedom of the open land coursing through her veins. The sack bounced gently against Jed's saddle, and she kept stealing glances at it, wondering what could be inside that commanded such care. The trail soon narrowed, winding along a steep ridge above a dry creek bed. Loose rocks shifted under the horse's hooves, and Maggie's pulse quickened. She leaned forward, gripping her reins tightly, every muscle tense. Jed rode beside her, calm and steady, his presence a silent reassurance. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, a gunshot, sharp and close. Maggie's horse reared, and she barely managed to stay in the saddle. From behind a cluster of rocks, two masked men emerged, rifles raised, blocking the trail. Their horses pawed the ground, eyes wide and frantic. "Hold it right there," one shouted, voice trembling with aggression. "That sack's coming with us." Maggie's heart raced. She knew the sack held something important to Jed, something he would never let fall into the wrong hands. Without thinking, she nudged her horse forward, letting out a shout to distract the attackers. Jed reacted instantly, dismounting with practiced ease and positioning himself between Maggie and the bandits. His rifle was steady, aimed with deadly precision. "Back off," he barked. "You don't want this fight." One of the men fired, the bullet kicking up dust at Jed's feet. He didn't flinch, returning fire with a warning shot that sent the bandits' horses skidding. Maggie's pulse pounded as she realized the danger was real, immediate. She couldn't just sit there. Remembering the skills she had honed on the trail, she swung her bag of supplies at a loose rock formation, sending a small cascade of stones tumbling toward the bandits. They yelped, scrambling to control their horses. Jed used the distraction, moving quickly, firing another warning shot, and lunging toward the nearest bandit to push him off balance. Maggie, heart hammering, realized she was more than just a passenger. She was part of the fight, part of the action, after what felt like an eternity but was only minutes. The attackers finally turned and fled, retreating down the ridge, shouting curses over their shoulders. Maggie sagged in the saddle, trembling with adrenaline and relief. Jed approached her, his face serious, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "You did good," he said quietly, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder. "You kept your head when most would have panicked." I didn't think I could," Maggie admitted, breathless. "But I had to. That sack, it's important to you, isn't it?" Jed nodded. "More than anything. But today, it wasn't just the sack, it was you. You proved you can ride the dangerous trail, face fear, and still stand tall. That's rare, Maggie, rare and damn impressive." Maggie felt a flush creep up her neck. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a warm, strange feeling, a mix of pride, relief, and something she couldn't quite name. Jed had seen her at her bravest, her most fearless, and he had acknowledged it. The rest of the ride back to Dusty Creek was quieter. The threat of the bandits still lingered, but so did the bond forged in the fire of danger. Maggie felt something shift inside Hirsch. She was no longer the too fat, too ugly girl she had always thought she was. Out here, with the wind in her face and Jed beside her, she was strong, capable, and alive by the time the town appeared on the horizon. The sun was dipping low, casting a warm glow over the buildings. Maggie glanced at Jed, heart still racing, and realized that the danger of the trail had brought them closer in ways words could not. Whatever lay inside that mysterious sack, she felt certain it held more than just material value. It held a promise, a secret, and perhaps a new beginning. The town of Dusty Creek glowed under the late afternoon sun, its wooden buildings casting long, angular shadows across the dusty streets. Maggie Thompson walked beside Jed Hawkins, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust as they approached the livery stable. The sack, which had been the center of so much mystery, now rested safely across Jed's saddle, tied securely and handled with utmost care. Maggie's curiosity had been gnawing at her since morning. She tried not to ask, tried to distract herself with thoughts of the trail and the adrenaline from their run-in with the bandits. But the closer they got to the stable, the more her mind raced. What's inside? What could be so important that Jed risked everything to protect it? Jed tied his horse and looked at her, his expression unreadable, though his eyes sparkled with a mix of anticipation and something gentler, something that made Maggie's heart thump faster. "We're here," he said quietly. "Time to see what's in the sack." Maggie's hands twitched at her sides. She had been imagining everything from a treasure chest of gold coins to a rare horse saddle, and maybe even a letter with some old secret. Jed reached down and carefully untied the top of the burlap sack, the coarse fabric rough against his fingers. He opened it slowly, as if revealing the contents too quickly might spoil something precious. Maggie leaned in, squinting into the shadowy interior, and then she saw it. It wasn't gold, it wasn't a weapon, it wasn't some rare artifact, it was her. Maggie's eyes widened, her jaw slackening. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but there she was, standing inside the sack with her own wide-eyed reflection, staring back in the small, cracked mirror Jed held beside her. Jed grinned, a slow, warm smile that made Maggie's cheeks burn. "Surprise, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a mix of humor and seriousness. "I told you this was important. And it is. More than you know." What is this?" Maggie stammered, confusion mingling with shock. Jed stepped closer, placing a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. This sack isn't about what you think. It's about what you've shown, your courage, your heart, your fire. Dusty Creek may have called you too fat to dance, too ugly to wed, but I've seen who you really are, and I'm not the kind of man who lets a fine woman like you go unnoticed. Maggie felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of embarrassment, joy, and disbelief. You carried me in a sack, she whispered, incredulous. Not literally, Jed said, chuckling. But I wanted you to understand how I see you. Through all the whispers, through all the judgment, you're strong, you're brave, and you're the kind of woman a man doesn't let pass him by. Her heart was racing, each beat echoing in her ears like the thundering of hooves on a dusty trail. She had spent her whole life feeling invisible, judged by the shallow standards of a town that couldn't see past appearances. And here was Jed Hawkins, a man who had watched her dance, ride, and fight danger, telling her that she was seen, truly seen. Jed knelt slowly, reaching into the sack one last time. From it, he drew a small, worn leather box. This is for you, Maggie. Not because you're perfect, not because you fit any mold, but because you're exactly who you are. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that you're exactly right for me. Maggie's hands shook as she took the box. Inside lay a simple silver ring, unadorned but shining in the fading sunlight. She looked up at Jed, speechless, her eyes brimming with tears she hadn't realized were waiting. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Jed replied softly. Just promise me you'll keep being you, and maybe, promise me you'll marry me. Maggie laughed through the tears, a sound that rang clear and true in the quiet of the stable yard. Yes, she said, her voice firm, yet filled with emotion. Yes, Jed, I'll marry you. Jed smiled, slipping the ring onto her finger. Dusty Creek had judged her, tested her, and tried to define her by its shallow standards. But here, in the light of the late afternoon sun, with the man who had seen her strength and courage, Maggie realized that she was finally free. Free to dance, free to ride, free to love and to be loved in return. The sack had been more than a mystery. It had been a journey. And at the end of that journey, Maggie Thompson discovered something greater than herself. The power of being truly seen, and the courage to accept love on her own terms. The morning sun spilled over Dusty Creek like liquid gold, turning the wooden facades of the saloon, the livery stable, and the general store into gleaming towers of light. Today wasn't about the dust or the heat or the long, endless trails of the frontier. Today was about Maggie Thompson and Jed Hawkins, and the town had never seen a moment like it. Word had spread quickly. Dusty Creek, which had once whispered that Maggie was too fat to dance and too ugly to wed, now buzzed with anticipation. The townsfolk had been invited to witness the union of two of the town's bravest souls, though most still whispered under their breath, marveling at the irony of how fate could turn a story upside down. Maggie adjusted the simple white dress she had chosen, the fabric soft and flowing despite the ruggedness of the town around her. It was nothing like the fancy gowns she had once imagined wearing. There were no frills, no lace, just herself, standing proud and strong. And that was all she needed. Jed arrived, looking every bit the rugged cowboy the townspeople expected, boots dusty, hat low over his brow, eyes shining with a mixture of humor and affection. He tipped his hat at Maggie, and she felt her heart skip a beat. He was as steady and dependable as the mountains that surrounded Dusty Creek. And now, he was hers. The ceremony was simple. Reverend Thompson, no relation, though he insisted on giving a few parental words, stood under the shade of a lone oak tree. The townsfolk gathered in the dusty clearing, some sitting on crates, others on horseback, all witnessing a love story that had unfolded against the harshest of backdrops. Reverend Thompson cleared his throat. We are gathered here today in Dusty Creek to celebrate a union forged in courage, respect, and adventure. Maggie Thompson has shown a heart as brave as any man's, and Jed Hawkins has shown a soul as steady as the river that runs through these hills. Together, they stand, not as who the world expects them to be, but as who they truly are. Maggie felt her hand tighten around Jed's. He gave her a small, reassuring squeeze in return, his thumb brushing over hers in a silent promise. You may now exchange your vows. The Reverend continued. Jed spoke first, his voice low but clear. Maggie, I've seen you in the dust, in the danger, and in the quiet moments we shared on the trail. I've seen the fire in your heart, the courage in your soul, and the beauty that no one else seemed to notice. I promise to stand by you, to ride beside you, and to face whatever trails life throws at us together. Maggie's eyes shimmered. She swallowed, then spoke, her voice strong and unwavering. Jed, I've spent my life believing the world didn't see me, believing I wasn't enough. But with you, I see that I am. I see that I'm worthy of love, of trust, and of partnership. I promise to ride through life with you, through dust and sun, through trials and joys, for all my days. The Reverend smiled, a rare warmth in his weathered face. Then, by the powers vested in me, and in the sight of this town, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Jed leaned in, the breeze tugging at his hat and the dust swirling around their boots. Maggie tilted her head, closing her eyes, and for a moment, it was as if the world itself held its breath. When their lips met, the townsfolk erupted in cheers. Horses neighed, dogs barked, and even the saloon cats paused to watch the celebration. The wedding feast was modest but joyful. Tables of cornbread, roasted meats, beans, and fresh-baked pies lined the clearing. Children ran with ribbons, laughter echoing through the streets. And the adults toasted with mugs of strong coffee and the occasional splash of whiskey. Maggie danced not because anyone expected it, but because she wanted to, spinning with a freedom she had never known. Jed joined her, steady and strong, lifting her with ease, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of Dusty Creek life as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in the soft glow of twilight. Maggie looked around at the people who had once judged her. There were nods of approval, smiles, and even the occasional sheepish glance, but none of that mattered anymore. She had found her place, not because the town had deemed her worthy, but because she had proven her worth to herself, and Jed had seen it all along. Jed wrapped his arm around Maggie, pulling her close as they watched the last of the sunlight disappear behind the hills. You know, he said softly, we make a pretty good team, don't we? Maggie laughed, resting her head against his shoulder. The best, she replied, and it's just the beginning. In Dusty Creek, where dust met sky and the trails never ended, a new chapter had begun. Maggie Thompson and Jed Hawkins' cowboy and courageous heart had found something rarer than gold, rarer than the wide-open plains. Love, respect, and a life to ride together, come what may. And for the first time, Maggie danced for herself, for love, and for the promise of every sunrise yet to come.